There are over 200 countries, regions, or economies. Their GDP per capita are plotted on the histogram, from the lowest to the highest, along with the figure of Vietnam. Many data points are bundled up at the low end. Log scale can be used to spread them out. On the log scale, the data are spread out more evenly. Descriptive statistics of normal distribution can be used to roughly characterize the essential properties, mainly the mean mu, the median, and the standard of deviation. The median divides data into two halves. The upper half represents relatively higher productivity economies and the lower half, lower productivities. The standard of deviation is a rough measure of how wide the gap is between the upper and lower economies. An important value is the world average, which is almost $11,000, substantially higher than the mean or median of around 6,000. The reason is that the distribution treats each country as one person. There are more people in high productivity countries than those with lower productivities, hence, the world average is substantially higher than the mean or median here. Vietnam is in the lower half, and just about 1/3 of the world average. For relative comparison, cumulative distribution can be used. The median by definition is at the 50% mark, which divides the data into an upper half and a lower half. The world GDP average is about at 63 percentile, and Vietnam GDP is about 34 percentile. It means among 205 economies, Vietnam is about 2/3 below and 1/3 above others. The story of Vietnam GDP should be viewed with a historical context. The data used in the follow are from the World Bank. The GDP data for over 200 economies and over approximately 60 years are shown. The left-hand side show the time series data plot on log scale, and the right-hand side, histogram just as above, except that it is not just for 1 year, but about 60 years. As the time slice moves back and forth from 1962 to 2020, the exact distribution shape is not of interest. It is sufficient to consider its overall statistics, the mean mu, the median MED, and the standard of deviation sigma. The log normal model gives a general idea of the GDP distribution over 60 years without the fluctuations of the raw data. The mean and median show the growth trend, the standard of deviation shows the spread in economic efficiency, and the world average gives a reference. Although with ebbs and flows, the GDP growth is steadily upward. The distribution spread increases moderately, and fluctuates along with the growth but not excessively. The world average runs parallel with the median. Over approximately 60 years, the median has a net gain of 24.4, an effective annual rate of 5.5%. The efficiency gap between the upper and lower economies varies, and the net increase is only 27%. The world average maintains approximately the same gap with the median, indicating little changes in the demographic productivity difference between the upper and lower economies. To understand Vietnam GDP and economy, it is necessary to consider the recent history. Vietnam economy went through an unstable phase in the mid-1980s, and was at a lowest point in 1989. Since then, it has grown a factor of 37 times, with an effective annual rate of 11.7%. Over the same period, the world median grew at 4.3%, and the world average grew at 3.3%. Hence Vietnam economy for the last 30 years outperformed many lower economies. Relative performance can be seen with cumulative distribution chart as shown previously, but over the time episode. With the additional time axis, the cumulative distribution chart, plotted over the 60-year episode is a 3D graph. The axes are time, log GDP, and percentile scale. The horizontal contours mark the percentile values from 10 to 90% and 50% is the median. In terms of relative growth, Vietnam economy went from the bottom at 0% in 1989 to 34% in 2020. This is a recovering rate that is comparable to typically fast-growing economies for the past many decades. Neglecting the large swing of the 80s, Vietnam GDP growth over the last 30 years can be seen in two episodes. In the first episode, the GDP per capita increased 5.2 times, but the relative gain is only 9%, because the whole world economy was also growing well. In the second episode, although the GDP per capita increased only 3.1 times, the relative gain is substantially more at 14%, as the world economy grew more slowly. This suggests Vietnam economy was also becoming more competitive than the first episode. Given the speed that Vietnam GDP went from 0 to 34%, it is worthwhile to benchmark Vietnam rate of growth with other economies of the past. The growth rate is the time derivative of log of the value. However, for most economies and data, there is substantial year-to-year fluctuation, hence it is difficult to see a trend of the growth rate as there are too much variations. One technique is to use moving average to smooth out the data. As can be seen in these charts, as the moving average time window is larger, the data are smoother and the long-term trends of the growth rates are clearer. Here, it shows that Vietnam GDP growth rate from mid-1990s to 2020 is consistently equal to, or higher than both the world average and median. This also shows why the second episode from 2008 to 2020 is more significant than the first, because the growth rate is sustained higher than the world average for a longer duration. In the follow, the Vietnam data will be benchmarked by historical comparisons. The left chart shows the GDP per capita of the world's three largest economies and Vietnam. The time shift approach allows benchmarking economies with respect to each other's in terms of time. For example, this shows Vietnam GDP per capita is comparable to that of China about 11 years earlier. China growth rate shows alternate fast growth spurts, the peaks, and slowdowns, the valleys, with approximately 11-year period over 6 decades. The last growth spurt was the highest with 20% at the peak, and longest lasting from mid-2000s to mid-2010s. Remarkably, Vietnam and China growth rates are similar for the last 25 years. With the mid-1990s recovery episode excluded, Vietnam has had only one growth spurt. Episodic growth spurts with slowdowns are quite common to economies undergoing transformation, and if Vietnam is to maintain its development, similar subsequent growth spurts are necessary. With respect to Japan, Vietnam GDP per capita is comparable to that of Japan 47 years ago. Vietnam's first and the only growth spurt did reach nearly the same level as that of Japan's economic miracle episode. But what made the miracle a miracle, is the longevity and durability of the high growth rate from the 1960s until the crash of the bubble in mid-1990s. Since then, Japan could not rekindle its miracle and its lost decade has extended to decades and counting. What Vietnam needs is to avoid its own lost decades after its first and only growth spurt. A most notable comparison is Vietnam economy versus the Asia Tiger economies. Vietnam 2020 GDP per capita is comparable to that of South Korea 33 years earlier, and 42 years earlier compared with Hong Kong and Singapore. Although the tiger economies were only noticed in the mid-1980s to 1990s, the pre-growling phase in the 1970s were actually more substantial and consequential with higher growth rates, which laid the foundation for the subsequent soaring phase. Vietnam's most recent growth spurt is most similar to this pre-roaring phase in the 1970s. A growth spurt is usually associated with transformative changes, for example, from shipbuilding's heavy constructions to semiconductors, electronics, to high-value consumer durables like automotive, or financial services. This transformative growling tiger phase was what made these economies soaring after the priming phase of the 70s, and Vietnam's first phase of the 2010s is most similar to it. With respect to its Southeast Asia neighbors, Vietnam 2020 GDP per capita is comparable to that of Indonesia 4 years earlier, 13.5 years earlier with respect to Thailand, and about 21 to 30 years earlier with respect to Malaysia. Vietnam was not affected by the Asia financial crisis like its neighbors. This saved Vietnam's first growth spurt, which is also similar to those of its neighbors in the 1990s. It remains to be seen if Vietnam can generate the next growth spurt similarly to these neighbors after the Asia financial crisis. In summary, for 3 decades from 1990s to 2020, Vietnam economy was in a recovering mode going from 0 percentile to 34%, thanks to a high growth rate exceeding that of the world median and world average. In late 1950s to early 1960s, Vietnam GDP per capita is estimated to be comparable to those of Thailand and China, and the nature of its economy, mainly agrarian, was also similar to its neighbors. From the early 1980s to mid-1990s, Vietnam economy has its own lost decade that occurred in an inopportune episode, when there was fast economic expansion in Eastern Asia. Hence it is no surprise that time shift benchmarking indicates Vietnam of 2020 is similar to other economies in earlier episodes, ranging anywhere from 11 years with respect to China to 42 years with respect to Singapore. In terms of growth rate, Vietnam's is quite similar to China's over the last 2 decades. A relevant and accurate comparison is to compare Vietnam recent growth to those of other Asia economies of the 70s such as pre-Tiger South Korea, or Malaysia. As discussed earlier, an essence of economic growth is transformational changes that would bring one growth spurt after another. For example, South Korea's and Malaysia's economies were comparable in the 70s, but South Korea's transformation resulted in a large divergence between the two in the Tiger phase of 1990s. Although China had 5 episodes of growth spurts, only the last 2 went over 15% growth rate and sustained a high level, which is responsible for China being the world top 2 economies. Vietnam has had only one growth spurt, which is the recovery. Its future shall depend on any transformational changes that may come.